Hi, my name is Chuck Lambert. I'm an associate professor in special education and education leadership here at Western, and this is my first attempt at a voiceover PowerPoint. When I designed the course, I wanted to make sure that there were opportunities for folks who learn best by listening, as well as folks who learn best by reading. Um, and I also have some activities that you need to do to try to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to actually do and practice and write a little about these different topics. If if you are like me and you learn best by hearing and looking at materials, then these voiceover PowerPoints are probably for you. Uh, the same material is pretty much in the book chapters and if you're interested in just the written material, you'll see online that I've also provided you with the notes without the voiceover captions. So if you learn best that way, do that. If you can tolerate the voiceover on the PowerPoints and that's helpful, do that. But you get a little bit of a choice here as to um, how you access the material best. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so when we start talking about special education, it's important for us to make sure that we have some common language and some common definitions that we can use. And the reason for this is that there are some words that we all know that words can hurt, and sometimes even folks with the best of intentions will use the wrong word, and that and someone gets offended, and so then no one listens to what else the person has said because they've gotten so hung up on how a person has misused a particular term. And so I want to try to early on kind of catch this and make sure that you are aware of kind of the current terms that we use and also what the current definitions are for those words so that you don't inadvertently offend folks when you're particularly parents when you're talking about students with disabilities. This happens most often when you use the terms handicap and disability, in that how we use them kind of out in the world isn't the actual definitions that the World Health Organization uses, that came up with the definitions for these words in 1980 that we still use today. So a good example where someone could be offended if we start talking about how a kid is handicapped. For a lot of parents, that's going to be very derogatory, and so they're not going to be able to listen to what else you have to say. All they're going to be stuck on is the fact that you said that their kid was handicapped. So let's make sure that we just have some common understandings of these key terms, and then that limits or at least reduces the opportunities that we have to alienate people before we even get a chance to really engage in a conversation and look at kind of meaningful interaction. So some of the common terms that are important to cover are listed here on the slide. So the first one is exceptional children. When we talk about exceptional children, we're including all children who differ from the norm, either above the norm or below the norm. And their performance or their difference is to such an extent that they require individual programs to meet their specific needs. So we look at that with gifted education for students who are so far above their peers that we need to provide more individualized or advanced instruction. And it's also true for students that are below the mean to such a degree that they require individualized programming as well. So I once taught a course that was called Exceptional Children. This was at another university, and it was a summer course, and it was for current teachers. And someone in the class was so disgusted because they thought the term exceptional children was to talk about gifted education, and that this course was just going to be about gifted education. And so immediately I was offended because I thought, well, gosh, why are you only interested in gifted education? That's what we're going to cover in part of the course, but that's not what the whole course is about. So right there just gives an example of how using the wrong term or not understanding what terms mean can lead to misunderstandings that can interfere with our interactions with others. Another term that can get you in trouble is the term impairment. So when we talk about an impairment, we're talking about the loss or reduced function of a body part or organ. So for example, if someone has MS, they may have reduced function in their legs and the ability to walk and to move around fluently. So that would be an impairment. The impairment is the reduction, the reduction in function. So if someone has received an amputation, obviously if they had a below the knee amputation, then the loss of their leg then is an impairment. It's a loss of access to a body part or organ. And the next term we have to be aware of is disability. So a disability exists when an impairment limits a person's ability to perform certain tasks. So for the examples I just gave, both with MS as well as with someone who has had an amputation, both of those individuals may have a disability when they try to walk. So so missing part of your leg is a disability when it comes to walking. So you can think too about kind of how other impairments may affect the performance of certain tasks or certain behaviors. Okay, the other definition that I want to cover, or another definition I want to cover, is handicap, and this is the one that we can often get ourselves into a lot of trouble. So, a handicap is a problem encountered when interacting with the environment. So it's important to know that not all children with disabilities are handicapped, and that when we use the term handicap, we always refer to it about an environment and not about a person. A person is never handicapped. A person may be experiencing a handicap in a particular environment. So let me give you another example. So in undergraduate, I got my teaching certificate in Spokane, and so when I would go up and ski in Spokane, you'd go up to Mount Spokane. That was the closest place you could go skiing. And so there was a guy there who was an amazing skier, much better skier than I ever was. And he had an amputation. I'm not quite sure if it was above or below the knee. Now I'd pay more attention. But he was an amazing skier. He could, he passed me as I was, following my way down the mountain time and time again. So in that particular situation, he had a impairment, which was an amputation, loss of limb. But when he was skiing with his prosthetic leg, he didn't have a disability. He could ski better than most of the folks that were out there. So in that environment, with his prosthetic ski, he was not disabled. He was, quite able to ski around just fine. Now, there were certain situations where he was handicapped. So at the time at Mount Spokane, there was, in order to get up to the lodge, there was, I can't remember, a whole bunch of stairs that you had to climb. Then you kind of skied in, and then there was a whole bunch of stairs to climb in order to get into the lodge. And so for him, and I was amazed at this too, that he could do this, but it did clearly pose a handicap. He would kind of take his ski off of his boot, and then kind of use that as a cane, and he could hold on to the other rail of the stairs, and he could kind of hold his prosthetic leg out to his side, and slowly and deliberately he would kind of hop up. He loosened his boot, obviously, but could kind of hop up with his boot, stair by stair. And it took him quite a while to get up the stairs to get into the lodge. But it was clear that in that environment, there was no way for him to just be able to ski straight into the lodge. That going up stairs was a disability for him, particularly with his ski prosthesis on, but that he was really handicapped in that situation back in 1993 or whatever at Mount Spokane because um, um, because there were only stairs that for him to be able to access the lodge. There was no better accommodation. There was nothing. Um, those stairs really got in his way from being able to get up and kind of access to the lodge and gain access to the lodge. So there are other situations where you can use handicap as well. We oftentimes think of, like, imagine if you're taking a test and you're using a bubble sheet, one of those Scantron forms, and the form and your pencil breaks, and now you can't get the information that you have then down on the page. In that situation, it would be appropriate to say that you're handicapped in that particular situation because there's no way for you to actually communicate your knowledge then onto the Scantron form if you don't have the pencil. So the term handicap doesn't necessarily imply that a person has a disability or an impairment. That we can talk about handicapping conditions for typically developing folks as well. But most often the term is used, or historically has been used with people with impairments or with disabilities. So we'll look at another couple examples as we talk through kind of about these. Another one we could look at is that perhaps somebody has a reading disability. So the presumed loss or reduction of functional body part or organ would be some sort of brain, potential brain dysfunction, although we haven't actually seen that in MRIs, but we make this assumption that people with learning disabilities have some brain function differences. So the disability would be with reading, in that this person has an impairment that limits their ability to read. And then in some classes, that person may be handicapped, and in other classes, that person may experience and may not experience a handicap or a handicapping condition. So imagine if you're in a class where, let's say it's a literature course, and you have a student with a reading disability. If that person is expected to read the book, and we already know that they have an inability or a challenge when it comes to reading, that may provide a handicapping condition for that particular student. But if that student had access to the book had access to an audio recording of the book, or there are books called, which are low readability books, which are basically the same storyline, but use simpler vocabulary. If the person had access to those types of things, that person may not be handicapped in a literature course. So, for example, they may be able to then, talk about the themes and engage in all the conversations as a class around a particular book. They just wouldn't be able to read the book. That we could make the same argument for someone who has a visual impairment or who's blind. So their impairment is their inability to see. That provides a disability in areas like reading text, but and in some conditions they'll be handicapped if they're expected to read, but in other conditions, if they're able to gain access to an audio version of that book, or if they're Braille readers, to provide them a Braille copy of the book, they may not be handicapped in that particular situation. So you can see kind of those three different terms have clearly kind of different meanings. So the last term we want to talk about is at risk. And when you have someone who uses the term at risk, you really got to ask a follow-up question about, well, what do you mean, or how are you defining at risk? So how the World Health Organization defines at risk is children who have a greater than usual chance of developing a disability. But it doesn't get much more specific than that. So whenever we look at researchers who use the term at risk, you really have to look at what is their definition, because are we talking about academically at risk? Are we talking about students that are behaviorally at risk? And what are the criteria that we're using to make those kind of decisions, those kind of as to who qualifies that and who doesn't qualify under this at-risk category. So how many exceptional children are there? And the truth is, this is a very difficult question. When we look at how many people with disabilities there are, that question is almost impossible to actually come up with an actual number. And part of that's because most disabilities are determined by a physician, and that physicians make a diagnosis, and that's kind of where it's left with who's determined to have particular disabilities. If we look at what state criteria are required, both for adults as well as with children, states can have criteria that differ for receiving particular services. And this is probably the most clear when we look at who qualifies for special education services. That's probably the most restrictive population that we look at for identifying folks with disabilities. There's a lot more people out there with disabilities than there are people out there who are receiving special education services during school age. So, it's just difficult to say. We know that state criteria are different for different states. A student may receive special education services in New York, let's say, but that they would not receive services possibly if they move to Virginia. And so just the state definitions change, and so students still have to meet those state definitions when they move from state to state. Also, some states do a better job at providing preventative services, which for different communities, and that can change the number of students that receive special education services and the number of students that may have had some academic or behavioral challenges, but that those don't necessarily turn into disabilities later in life. And so that's hard to really figure out how we count them. So, how do you count someone who has a learning disability but does really, really well in school, and there's no clear test or guidance to tell us that this person has particular problems? Does that person still have a learning disability even if they no longer have problems with reading and writing and completing math facts throughout school? So there's some of these kind of bigger questions that make it even harder to kind of figure out the numbers. When we speak specifically of special education, we know that the total population by the states is around about 9 to 13% of school age population will be receiving special education services. Now, there's an odd rule at the federal level. So the federal government provides for most states and for most districts the majority of the money to educate students with special needs who are receiving special education services. And the federal government has a rule that if a state has more than 13% of its population identified as needing special education services, that the federal government will withhold funding for special education programs for that state. Now, when you hear that, you think, oh my gosh, that's crazy. How can the federal government be determining what percentage of the population needs special services, and how why what makes this arbitrary number 13 so important? And from the federal government's point of view, they consider that 13%, really about 10, is what's considered special, and that if you have a large group of students in a particular area, in a particular population that are seem to have disabilities, then there's some real question about, is that really require special education, or is the best treatment general education services? So, for example, let's say we find a particular district where 50% of the district students are identified by a pediatrician as having ADHD. So the state would provide pressure on the district, and the federal government would provide pressure on the state to make sure that only those exceptional students, a small number of students, the students who most need services, will be the ones that will qualify and receive services for special education. So even though you may have a lot of students that have particular need in a classroom, only a very small percentage will be receiving actual special education services. So in special education, and already we've used a bunch of terms. I wanted to talk a little bit about why we label and classify students in classify exceptional students, and some of the reasons that are probably the most compelling as to why do we bother even talking about or labeling students with disabilities, or students that are gifted, is to really recognize that there are differences in learning and behavior, and that when we use terms, or we use qualifying terms, that we really want to make it clear that we're talking about a group of population that seem to share some common characteristics when it comes to kind of learning and behavior. So that is one possible benefit of labeling. Another is that it may lead to more acceptance of atypical behavior by peers. And we see this kind of all the time throughout our culture, where if we've got a name for something, it oftentimes makes it easier for us to explain why people may be seeing particular behaviors from particular individuals. And so it provides at least or at least there's this idea that it may lead to more acceptance of atypical behaviors when it's explained to peers and other people in the community. It also helps professionals communicate, disseminate research findings. It would be very difficult for those of us, for teachers and for those of us who research people with particular disabilities, if we didn't have common language to use to be able to communicate with each other, and then also to be able to disseminate our research findings, and to be able to kind of classify what populations we're working with, and what strategies seem to be most effective with particular disabilities or particular abilities. It also provides a means for funding and resources that are often based on categories. So that's just kind of how the federal government works. It has particular groups that they will fund research for particular populations or particular needs, and so having that language is helpful. It's also helpful for advocacy groups to promote awareness. So I think you can see this probably right now. The number and the effects of advocacy groups, particularly for children with autism, are particularly visible, and it helps kind of promote awareness of disability kind of throughout our culture. And I already just kind of said this, so it also makes special needs more visible, and that if we actually have a name and we actually have something to call it, then it can lead to actually being able to differentiate and be able to notice disability more. So there are some possible disadvantages of labeling as well. One of the big ones that we see that is that the whole labeling process really focuses on student deficits. So when you're trying to get student services by identifying them as having a need for special education, the whole identification process really focuses on how far the student is or how poorly the student is achieving compared to their peers. And so as with all of us, none of us want to be reduced to just a particular skill or deficit area that we have, that we're whole people, and that and we try, and even though interventions try to be strength-based in their approach, the actual act of labeling students increases the risk of really, again, just focusing on what's wrong and not what's right or what's working in a student's educational setting. We also know that this may be stigmatizing for students and cause rejection. When you think of the put-downs that you can hear that relate to special education, it's hard to imagine somebody saying, "Oh yeah, I want that. I really want to go to school on the short bus," or "I really want to, to be in special ed." When you think of other put downs that and the whole movement to quit using or to decrease the use of the term or the acceptability of the term retarded. Um, you know, none of that feels good or feels fun for students that are already struggling in general education. And so that is a real risk of labeling students. We also know that it could negatively affect student self-concept. Again, um, who wants to be associated with something that's where students are teased and made fun of. We also know that it may lead to low expectations. We see this quite often both with special education teachers as well as with general education teachers, that once a student is labeled as needing special education, that in a way it provides the possibility for a teacher to kind of wash their hands of a particular student. So instead of looking at what are some other ways to be able to connect and to be able to allow a student to learn in a particular situation, some teachers just say, oh, well, now this student's in special education, they're not my problem. Or, or that there's a belief that just because they have a disability, that means that it impedes them or prevents them from being able to learn a particular subject or a particular material in that class. And that can end up leading to these kind of fictional explanatory constructs that people have, and that, again, believing that students with certain disabilities can't achieve or they can't make meaningful progress, and they can't learn. And it ends up becoming this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy because, as teachers say, oh, I don't know why this kid's in my class and they don't seem to want to learn from me. Students also pick up on that, and then the students don't learn, which then seems to reinforce the teacher's original beliefs, whether or not that was true for that particular student or not. So, that's really problematic. We also see that labels have a certain amount of permanence, and the system really doesn't provide a lot of help or a lot of kind of space for that. Typically, we wait to label students in special education until they're significantly behind their peers, and with that, it's often difficult for students to then exit special education. That even once they've learned particular skills and are now their achievement is now kind of matching that of their peers, we're often very concerned about kind of exiting students from special education. And it also is hard, I think, for a lot of folks in how they conceptualize and kind of think about disability, in that if a person may have a disability at one period of time in their life, once they now are indistinguishable from their peers, do they still really have that same disability? I think about this particularly with a lot of the invisible disabilities, when we look at learning disabilities and attention deficit hyperactivity, and some of those disabilities that you can't see, that there's no biological test or brain scan or CAT scan or MRI or PET scan that can be done to actually show some sort of lack of function. And so, it is a legitimate question to ask. So, if a student has a learning disability and now they've learned the skills to be able to cope and to be able to compete with their peers, do they really still have a learning disability? If now that they've learned these coping strategies and and they've kind of caught up again with their peers, and there's no way to distinguish what they can do or what their performance is to their peers, does the student really still have a learning disability? And these are some questions that I think a lot of people really struggle with, and about this notion of permanence, and it's often difficult as to a lot of people become the aspects of their disability really become part of their identity as well, and so that's something to always which makes things even more problematic, and that do disabilities really go away? So that whole notion of kind of labeling at first, whether or not the student may continue in special education, is one thing, but we also see that there is just kind of this permanence of this label where people are always may always experience or may always think that they still have problems even when they're competing and doing quite well compared to their peers. We also see it as a basis to keep students out of general education classrooms. So the argument can often be made that if a student is labeled in receiving services for special education, that somehow now general education can wash their hands of this particular student, and it's now the student is now the problem of the special educator. And I think a lot of our kind of our community at large, I think, really does kind of differentiate students as to special education students versus general education students. I mean, I think even my mom, as she's like, when she tells me stories of kind of what's going on with their day, if she runs across a person who has a very clear disability, she'll say to me, well, I ran into, like one of your kids today at the mall. So, and one of your kids is code for, someone who clearly has a disability. So, so again, that notion of like, my kids versus your kids, again, really isn't looking at the whole child and looking at, who's the teacher for the student at this period of time. So we'll talk about this a little bit later on, that the vast majority of special education students, the general education teacher is the primary and oftentimes the only teacher for that student. So special education is becoming more and more of a consultation and case management profession, and that's just kind of how things are going. So it's really not about my kids and your kids. It's really about all of our kids, because they're spending most of the time in general education classrooms. And then there's also this, just this kind of that disadvantage, in that it requires greater expenditures that might be spent on planning and delivery of instruction. And so the actual efforts that we have to make to actually provide adequate assessments to test and to identify students for special education, that works out to be a lot of money. And sometimes we do wonder if, gosh, why can't we just help the students that need help and not have to spend so much time in trying to do all this testing in order to just identify a student so that we know that we can provide special education services. And I think all of those are fair questions as to why is it that we need to label students in schools. So I wanted to show you just, and these numbers come directly from the chapter that's available for you to read, a list of the number of students served federally in each of the disability categories. So there's more than a dozen disability categories that make up special education. And so for a student to receive services for special education, they have to meet criteria in one of these, I don't even know what it is, 10 or 12 different categories that we have. And there's a kind of a loose federal definition as for each of these categories. Then each state has some more specific language to help identify students with a specific disability category. So you see on this slide we have the largest group, almost half of all students in special education are receiving services under learning disabilities. The next largest group is quite interesting. So that is a group of students with speech and language disabilities, and that makes up almost 20% of special education cases. But that number is a little misleading, because most students that are receiving services for speech and language disorders are students between the grades of like kindergarten and third grade. So for students in that age group, we see a lot of students that may have some problems with stuttering, or other speech and language problems, and those students are receiving services almost exclusively from a speech and language pathologist. And oftentimes we see that after 1 or 2 years of intervention with those students, they no longer need special education and are then dismissed or no longer receive special education services. So that number seems really high. It's actually a much higher percentage of special education when we look at just that kind of kindergarten through third grade period of time, because you see very few students at the middle school and high school that have speech and language disabilities. So the next largest group that we see used to be incorporated with that learning disability group. And actually, we've seen over time that the number of cases of LD have actually gone down quite significantly, but we see with other health impairment, that percentage has actually been increasing. So other health impairment used to be kind of a catch-all that we used for students with medical diagnoses that needed specific services, but they didn't fit one of these 12 categories of disabilities. And so what you see, the vast majority of students who are receiving services under other health impairment are students with attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And so those disabilities in and themselves are not, do not qualify for services under the Individuals with Disability Education Act, but they can fall under that other health impairment category. So what used to be one of the smallest percentage categories has now become the third largest category at about 11.6% of students receiving special education services are now under that other health impairment category. So the next one we see, and this is a new abbreviation that a lot of us are still kind of getting used to. So it's only been within the last 3 years that the federal government has changed the category of mental retardation to intellectual disability. And so it's, like with any other change, even though it's a change that was long overdue, you'll still see in a lot of documents MR being listed. But it's because, again, it's only been fairly recently that the federal definition has changed to intellectual disability. Individuals with intellectual disability make up about 8% of the population of students in special education. And then the next largest category is emotional behavior disorders, making up just about 7% of the category. And then one area that's also been increasing in size quite dramatically is the classification for autism. And autism is a relatively new category for receiving services and directly through special education as its own category. It used to be included in other health impairment years ago. And what we've seen is probably a doubling of autism just in the last of number of cases receiving services through IDEA in the last, probably 10 years. So the numbers are just dramatically increasing, and honestly, we're not quite sure what that's all about. We have some ideas about what it's not, and we'll talk about that more when we actually talk about autism as a category all on its own. So all the other students that were receiving special education services, if you lumped them all together, the kids with visual impairments, kids with traumatic brain injury, kids who are hearing impaired or deaf. So all the other categories make up about 7% of the population. So just to give you a scale, we'll move on to the next slide and look at the actual percentages. So here we see this data broken down in a little different way. Actually, this is data from the previous edition of the book, probably 5 or 6 years ago, which I can't find the original data file, otherwise I would have updated this, but actually it's kind of interesting to look at because we can see how some of these categories have changed in the last almost 10 years now. So for example, autism, the rates of autism, if you look on the previous slide, have almost doubled since this slide. But the point of the slide is not to look at the specifics of each of the disability categories, but to just look at that, look at how many students are being served under that kind of learning disability or other health impairment kind of category. And so when we see that, over half of students are receiving these services that really aren't what we think of when we think of special education. Most people don't think of learning disabilities or attention deficit disorder when we think about special education. Most people think about intellectual disabilities or autism or students with severe disabilities or multiple disabilities. But that's really not the case. When we're talking about kids with special that are receiving special education services. The vast majority are kids with learning disabilities or other health impairments. We're talking about little ones. We're looking at a high percentage of students that are receiving some short-term speech therapy that they're receiving, and that when we look at students with intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities, that number is actually pretty low. Kids with severe emotional behavior disorders, that number is very low. And actually autism is the one that we see that's increasing kind of by a rate of ×2 actually in a relatively short period of time. And then we're looking at a very short or very small amount of all the other categories of kids with disabilities. So now that we know kind of who are the students that are receiving special education services, it's interesting to know where these students are actually served in special education. So I went ahead and made this pie graph to just kind of demonstrate where are students that are receiving special education served. And the vast majority, 60%, receive 100% of their instruction in the general education classroom. So they're in your classrooms 100% of the time. They're receiving no pull-out services. The only services that they may be receiving are the teacher may be receiving some support services from special education. We also, the special educator is serving as a case manager for these students and making sure that and working with parents and those types of things. But for the vast majority, for 60%, those students are receiving 100% of their educational services by general education teachers and not by specialists in special education. So the next kind of largest group that we see is actually two pieces of the pie that look different in this diagram, but are actually the classroom may be the exact same classroom in a school. So we see that the next largest category is students receiving services in a resource room. That's 21%. And then the third category are separate classrooms, which is 15% of students receiving services in special education. So the challenge with these two types of placements is that these placements are differentiated only by the amount of time of the school day that a student is receiving special education services. So if a student is receiving special education services for less than 50% of the school day, and they're being pulled out and receiving services in another room, that's considered a resource room if it's under 50% of the school day. So if they're spending less than 50% of their school day in specific classes for special education, that's considered a resource room. Now remember, we're talking about all classes, so that includes electives, that includes art and music and PE. If they're in general education settings for more than 50% of the school day, then any services that they receive in special education, they're considered in a resource room if they're receiving pull-out services. And then the other classification is separate classrooms. And if students are receiving more than 50% of their instruction in special education, then they're considered to be in a separate class. So even though they may be receiving 1 or 2 or 3 courses of general education, and even though they may be physically in the same room with other students that are in a resource room, they're considered separate class students. So again, it's kind of this odd, this odd situation that for a large percentage of those students, you may walk into a classroom where students are receiving special education services together, and the special education teacher is providing some instruction, but you wouldn't be able to know just by looking at them which students are technically in a separate classroom versus which students are in a resource room. So it's just strictly based on what percentage of their day they're receiving special education services. Now there are some separate classrooms that are full-time and that people don't really come and go. So for example, there are, you see this for students with autism or students with more moderate to intensive disabilities. Oftentimes they're receiving most of their school day in a separate classroom in the school. This is also true for kids with emotional behavior disorders, that oftentimes they're receiving most of their instruction in a separate classroom just for kids with emotional behavior disorders. Just like we see in life skills classrooms, students with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities and students with autism receiving almost all of their instruction full-time in a separate classroom for students with disabilities. But again, that only makes up 15% of students, of the placement options that we see for students with disabilities. For students who are educated in separate schools, that means that the school site is actually at a different site than the public education, general education program. We call those separate schools, and that makes up just 2% of the population. Most of my teaching was actually in a separate school where I was working with high school students with who required special education services, and they needed them in a more intensive setting, and it wasn't safe to have them integrated fully into in a general education school. And I've also done some work in the last category, which is residential facilities, and it also includes hospital and home-based placement options. So that makes up another 2% of placements. So again, if students are having to spend the night somewhere, or their education is also in the same place that where they're living, we look at those as residential facilities, and that makes up about 2% of the population for special education. So, and again, a lot of those are very short-term placements. So a lot of students that are receiving some services in hospitals. That can include students that are suffering from really debilitating either short-term or long-term conditions. So, for example, students receiving treatments for cancers or other treatments may be receiving their educational services while receiving health services in the hospital. That hospitalization would also include students that are receiving psychiatric services. And then again, what we see too is that there are some students that school districts just decide that it's easier or cheaper just to have the student be placed at home and have tutors and teachers go out to the student's home to provide educational services. Unfortunately, we probably see those placements. They're pretty restrictive placements and doesn't really provide students with an opportunity to work and to socialize with other students. And so all of those are pretty restrictive placements when it comes to placing students with disabilities. So when we look at special education as an intervention, there's really three kind of approaches that special educators use to address academic and behavioral problems. So for some students, we may come up with an intervention as a preventative intervention or a preventative strategy. And the goal of preventative strategies is to reduce the onset of disability for those that are at risk. So an example might be if we happen to know that a particular student is at risk for developing a certain disability, we might provide some intensive early intervention for them in the hopes that we can kind of catch the problem before it develops into a disability. So we see a lot of early intervention programs with infants, children, and toddlers that are really preventative in nature. The student is nowhere near, or the child is nowhere near having developed a disability, but we know that they're at a greater risk than the average population of developing a disability. So we want to come up with early intervention strategies to really make sure that the student doesn't fall behind their peers. So another type of intervention that we use in special education are remedial-based interventions. And so remedial-based interventions are to reduce the effects of a disability. So the student has already been identified as having a disability in a particular area. It's our job to come up with an intervention that's probably an intensive intervention to try to get the student caught back up with their peers. So they're already significantly behind, and so we're going to teach either in a different way or provide additional instruction or provide a different type of instruction with the hopes of having that student get caught back up with their peers, to be able um, to really work on whatever the problem behaviors, the problem areas are, um, and provide an intervention to kind of fix that problem. Now, the third is compensatory interventions. So with compensatory interventions, as a special educator, you've already kind of decided that this disability, you've already worked usually for a number of years trying to come up with remedial strategies to get this student caught up with this particular skill with their peers. And you reach a point where it becomes evident, either because of the type of disability or whatever the specific impairment is that a student has, that the likelihood of them being able to actually complete the skill or to do the skill that compares with their peers, where they can actively compete, is unlikely. And so what we're doing is coming up with strategies that reduce to increase the function of that student in being able to complete kind of the bigger task, even though they may have problems with the specific area or specific skill. So a good example, if I were going to run through kind of one of these, come up with interventions that address both or all three, preventative, remedial, and compensatory strategies, we could look at reading, for example. So if I were going to do an early intervention program for reading, I may take students that we know from the literature are at a higher risk of developing learning disabilities later on. We might look at family members where one or more individuals receiving special education. We know they're at a high risk for developing learning problems, specifically learning disabilities later on in life. And we might provide some early intervention or some intensive reading instruction that may look a little bit different than what they are already getting in the general education classroom. So that would be an example of a reading instruction as a preventative measure. We might use the exact same intervention as a remedial strategy for a student who's in first or second grade, who's already fallen behind, or actually probably third grade, who's already fallen behind their peers significantly enough that they're receiving special education services. So again, we're going to try different strategies and maybe more intensive strategies than to teach a child how to read than what they're going to normally get at home or in the general education classroom. So the idea is to try to get them caught back up, to get them reading, so that reading isn't a long-term problem for them, that we can get them kind of caught up with their peers and with extra and intensive instruction. Now with reading, sometimes we may run across students that we've been teaching reading instruction for a number of years. They still don't have they still haven't developed kind of adequate reading skills, and so we may have to start looking at what are some strategies that we can do that is going to reduce the effects of that disability, of that learning disability, of the reading disability on that, for that student when they interact in kind of everyday life. So it might be that we might focus less on reading novels and make sure that the student is well aware of safety words and safety signs, and making sure that we're teaching language that students are most likely to interact with in the community. So we may decide that, we've done all we can to try to teach general reading. Now, what are the words that are most important for students to be able to read or to know in order to function in an everyday kind of situation? So we could do the same thing for math as well. So a preventative strategy might be to spend more time on basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, as we know that when those become fluent, math becomes easier. When those kind of basic computations are fluent for an individual, it's easier then to be able to apply them in more complex algorithms. So a preventative strategy might be providing additional resources and additional support, additional instruction on those those basic computations. And that might be the same intervention that we do for remedial. So, some students aren't quite up with their peers, so we're going to provide more intensive instruction on, for example, basic math facts. But there does become a time where it may be that we just acknowledge that, gosh, the student isn't really going to be able to master these math facts, and they're continuing to fall further behind their peers. So what are some strategies that we could do that would prevent the student's lack of knowledge of basic math facts to affect their ability to function in the community? So it might be something like allowing a student to use a calculator for basic computations. So that would be a compensatory strategy. It might also be for students with more moderate disabilities. We might teach them some other money skills that we might not be teaching in the general education environment, just to make sure that they have the life skills that they need, so that even though they may not have adequate math skills, at least they don't appear to have math deficits in the community. So, for example, for some students with more moderate to intensive disabilities, we may teach something called like a dollar more strategy. So we know that from the literature that students with disabilities tend to get ripped off in financial interactions at a very high rate. It just doesn't sound very good for people's chi, but it seems like a lot of people actually rip off people with disabilities at quite a remarkable rate of financial transactions. So one strategy that we can teach students who don't understand the concepts of coins or making change is just to teach the student the concept of a dollar more. So if we teach students to just listen when making a financial transaction to the dollar amount, so if the cashier says that's going to be $9.54, we teach the student to just focus on that first number, 9, and then to count out $9 to make a payment, and then just add a dollar more. And so it appears, as the student hands over $10, that they understand the concept of change, and they understand the concept of fractions of a dollar. But as the cashier then hands over the change, the student can then just collect the change without having to actually know the value of that change. So you can see that, again, that's a strategy that's not actually teaching the components that were lost in instruction, but are teaching the skills that people need to really be able to get by when they don't have the ability or haven't had the opportunity to actually learn the actual skills that other students have picked up either through family, friends, or through the community, or through instruction. So I often hear from teachers, as well as kind of from other folks, when they hear about what I do for a living, people will sometimes make statements about, why is it that people or students who are receiving special education or people with disabilities have all these more rights, or there's all these more laws to protect them, and why do we have to have all these additional regulations and limits for this particular population of students? And is it really fair to have a population of students that we're providing either additional or supportive measures that we don't provide to every single student that's in school? And I think it's a very good question, in that it really gets to that sense of kind of what is fair, and I think people are concerned about kind of where their money's going, and do wonder about what the value is of education dollars for students that are significantly behind their peers academically. And so a couple of the reasons why we ended up coming up with laws that govern special education, and and actually people with disabilities in general, and why we have to treat people with disabilities differently. A lot of it comes from really an unjust past. How people with disabilities have been treated historically, both in the United States as well as abroad, has been quite abysmal. And we have a long history of people being denied their civil rights, including access to educational opportunities. So in your reading, you'll see, that there have been court case over court case prior to some of the special education and general disability law that's been provided in making constitutional arguments as to why people with disabilities deserve the same rights as everyone else. And actually most of those laws, specifically around people with disabilities and education, kind of focus on two provisions of the U.S. Constitution. So one is spending power. And what spending power provides is it authorizes Congress to give money, to produce funds, and to attach conditions to those funds. So again, what the spending clause authorizes Congress to do is to spend money for either kind of the general welfare for the country. So Congress can either fund programs to advance constitutionally specific federal responsibilities, so things like the post office, things that the Constitution actually requires the federal government to do, and it can also fund state programs that and regulate them beyond specifically designated federal authority. So education is a good example for that. So the federal government has really relied on the states to provide educational services for students. So sometimes Congress just funds state programs that it likes, and they can do this, and they can offer money conditionally, saying that they're only going to adopt state programs, or they're only going to provide money for particular for particular things. They'll only provide money to states when they meet certain expectations or that they set. So effectively, what Congress is saying is, here's some money, but use it only for the programs that we think that all people should have. So things such as we've seen lately with health insurance and extension of Medicaid for children, and so we've seen actually some. This has been an interesting couple of years at looking at the spending power provision of the federal government, as we've seen with the new healthcare laws, and kind of how that's, at what point can the federal government continue to request things of states when they're not fully funding particular programs. So let's not talk about healthcare, because that's kind of a hot topic, and we're still not 100% sure how the Supreme Court's going to rule on some of those aspects of the Spending Powers Act, or Spending Powers protections from Congress. But let's look at some of the case law that has kind of supported that. So a good example would be like South Dakota versus Dole, which was a case way back in '87. And really what the Supreme Court was looking at was there was the federal government wanted to withhold a certain amount of money of transportation money from states that if the state allowed persons less than 21 years of age to purchase alcohol, they wanted to go ahead and withhold transportation or the money in the highway fund. And we've seen several of these cases at around about the same time. I think there was another case, most of them were in western states, looking at if states wanted to increase their federal speed limit above 55 at the time, there would be laws that were passed, and then the federal government would call over the weekend and say, okay, you just raised your speed limit to 70, and that's your right to do, but it's our right to withhold a certain amount of money then if you don't follow federal rules. And so the Supreme Court actually upheld this concept of spending power from Congress, um, with several kind of plains and western states when they had state legislatures that came up with rules that were really outside of the um, uh, came up with rules that were really outside of what the feds wanted for the states to do. So again, it's one of these situations where the federal government makes a requirement. The states can choose whether to comply or not, but if they choose not to comply with the federal guidelines, the feds can withhold a certain percentage of money for particular programs. And what we find is that states really like that federal money that they get. So usually, if there's a challenge, it's only for a short period of time, and then the state actually complies with the federal government so that they can get the full amount for whatever the program is. So a lot of these kind of early laws that were passed, early kind of litigation that occurred with special education were really looking at this kind of Spending Powers Act, where Congress said, no, you have to educate all citizens, and then federally people would challenge, states would challenge that authority, and Congress would then, and actually the executive branch would threaten to withhold education money if states did not provide educational services for students. And then also the 14th Amendment was used in a lot of litigation before we had some of the other special education laws to rule in favor of students with disabilities receiving access to public education. So remember, the 14th Amendment requires that states afford all citizens due process and equal protection of the law, and empowers Congress to enforce those guarantees. So, as you go through your reading, you'll see there's court case after court case of these of situations where people with disabilities were discriminated against in educational situations, and the courts slowly kind of ruling who were included in free, appropriate kind of public education. This kind of concept that everybody has a right to educational services, and so you see that in these early cases before we have kind of stronger legislation that provides more guidance as to what to do with students with disabilities. There's also one other case that I want to talk about, which is the Board of Education versus Raleigh. And this case is of particular importance in special education because the Supreme Court made it very clear that students have a right to free, appropriate public education, but that it really gets at this concept of what is kind of appropriate education. So in this case, it was a case of a student who was deaf, and actually, if you read about the book, you'll get even a better sense. But the student was deaf. The school district decided not to provide interpreter services for the student anymore. The school said that the student wasn't utilizing the interpretive services for the student who is significantly hard of hearing. And so the family wanted an interpreter for that student in the classroom. And so they ended up going to court, and it ended up going to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court ruled was, because the student was making, I think the student was getting C's or above C's or whatever, was passing classes, that the state was only required to provide appropriate educational services and not the best educational services. So they acknowledged that the student probably would have done better had she had an interpreter in the classroom. but they decided that because the student was passing, that was adequate, or again, this concept of appropriate amount of educational services. By the way, you can't deny people who are deaf access to interpreters or other services under other legislation, but what this ruling did provide was some guidance that we still use today when we look at special education and educational services really in general, and that public education really provides just access to appropriate education. It doesn't mean that we have to provide the best education that's available. So I always think about it a little bit like, schools only have to provide kind of the you-go of education, of like driving experiences, and not like the BMW. So something that's adequate that will get you around, but educational services don't have to be the best education. They just have to be appropriate or adequate. And oftentimes this is a case that's often cited whenever we talk about special education, because again, it's this concept that there's probably ways that we can make education for everyone better, but is that really it may not be constitutionally necessary to provide the best education. It's just required that we provide appropriate educational services. All right, and so this is the end of this PowerPoint, and good for you for sticking with it, because I think I talked a lot in this one. I won't be talking so much in some of the others. I think I've learned my lesson with this one, so thanks.